Apartheid really pervaded every facet of life in South Africa. So growing up in apartheid and becoming aware of what was going on around me was a huge thing. Obviously living in a society where the rules themselves were wrong, the police were wrong, the government was wrong, everything was incorrect, everything was topsy-turvy in relation to what we might here call a normal society, gave me a type of outlook that is probably slightly different to most people's, in that I would question authority, I would question everything that sort of dealt out to me. This was compounded by the fact that although I was born a privileged white person, that I come from a mixed religious background. My mother was a fundamentalist Christian, a Methodist, he was a happy clapping Methodist, and my father was a Jew, he was a secular Jew. That also gave me a very different slant on life, in that I didn't fit into any particular slot comfortably. And while at first it was quite irksome, and it gave me a lot of problems during my adolescence, in many ways it became a strength, in that I could pass myself off as one or the other, or look at one critically from the other viewpoint. So the combination of all of those things together really, I suppose in a sense, are the fundamental ingredients to my makeup and my philosophy, the way that I approach problems that I see in life. And social injustice perhaps is the biggest issue that I tend to confront. So if I see something that I don't agree with, or something that worries me, I'll actually make an image about it. I wouldn't call myself a rebel. I'd say it's fairly unusual, certainly in contemporary Australia, to be fairly socially critical. But that's not really a rebellious, I don't perceive that as a rebelliousness. I see that the traditional role of the artist is in fact to act as a counterfoil or a mirror on society, and to be able to actually reflect the rights and wrongs of that society. But of course that's not a particularly popular viewpoint to be taking these days.
If I asked you right now to think immediately of an image that represents to your mind apartheid, what would you think?
I'd probably go to one of my earliest works that are on the actual show here, which is The Burning Bus. In so many ways, the idea of the bus as a utilitarian vehicle for transport to make people's life easier, etc., is set on fire. And of course, the underpinning issue is, why is it on fire? Why is it burning? One looks for symbols, obviously very, very potent and powerful symbols that do represent the issues that one witnessed at that time. And I might point out that I actually witnessed most of what I actually paint about.
The latest events in South Africa, the massacre of the miners and the widespread jailings that have happened since, does this mean that South Africa has really learnt nothing from the apartheid days?
Well, in many respects, it's not a simple question to answer, but the fact of the matter is that any government, any people, they're all the same. And in essence, where you had greed and corruption before, in the post-apartheid democratic South Africa, there's rampant greed and corruption in high circles. Now, having said that, the actual violence that's being witnessed here, from my perception, there's a twofold reason for that. One is that it's actually a power grab for the succession of the leadership in South Africa, and the mines are where it's being played out, because the actual chief protagonists are a guy called Julius Malema, who was just recently kicked out of the African National Congress because he was the leader of the Youth League, and he was such an extreme right-winger that his fundamental standpoint was that every white settler got one bullet, and that didn't go down too well with the democratic leadership in the African National Congress. On the other side, the person who was most vociferous within the ANC, who organised his ousting, was Cyril Ramaphosa, who himself had been the head of the National Union of Mine Workers, and also is now one of the directors of certainly has major interests himself personally in the mines. So Julius Malema, who's a big troublemaker, has gone out of his way to actually create alternative unions, mine workers unions, and he's basically been stirring up the pot against the traditional ANC-backed unions. But it's got to do with the leadership in the ANC in South Africa.
In your stand against authoritarianism, against the the more oppressive aspects of one society. Have you felt the same sort of stirrings here in Australia regarding the general attitude towards the indigenous people and that sort of thing?
I've only been here in Australia for 25 years, so in many ways I've yet to learn quite a bit. But I have been observing things while I've been here, and my feelings are that we are disarmingly similar in Australia to South Africa, but markedly different. In terms of our indigenous people, of course, they are a small minority, and of course, as a multicultural country, we've got a variety of other racial issues to contend with. People have obviously come here en masse from Vietnam, there have been waves of people from Italy, Greece, etc., etc. And the issues surrounding the governmental and popular opinion about indigenous peoples in Australia, to some extent, they've sadly allowed those people to fall through the gaps of society. And it's an absolutely tragic situation in that there seemingly is no visible way of somehow acculturating them back into Australian, into the mainstream of society. What I've witnessed, particularly in the education area, is that there's been one of the attempts to address the imbalance between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal peoples in Australia is to actually segregate the Aborigines away from mainstream Australia. And from my viewpoint, from where I'm coming from, that's the worst possible thing to do, because in a sense to treat people different makes them feel differently. There's always been this talk of Aboriginal communities and addressing the community's needs, etc., etc. I've got a fairly extensive experience of having actually taught with and lived amongst Aboriginal peoples in central and outback New South Wales. And the reality is, from my perception, is that there's no cohesive or coherent communities as such, Aboriginal communities. Those communities have actually largely been destroyed. My personal response has been one painting that I've made, and it took me over 20 years before I felt comfortable to make the painting, was I've done a portrait of an Aboriginal man staring directly into the viewer's eyes in a very, very accusing way. I've in fact called it J'accusais, which is based on Zola's a very famous document where he indicted the French government for their scandalous behaviour in the Dreyfus case. And this Aboriginal man who designates himself Aboriginal by having an Aboriginal coloured headband is wearing a T-shirt that basically declaims Aboriginal deaths in custody. So it's really a very, very confronting image, and in so many ways a didactic image like that, while perhaps out of step with the type of contemporary way that issues of Aboriginality are dealt with, in many respects, from my point of view, certainly goes to the heart of the issue. It's still happening. It should never happen, and that's an absolute tragedy.
It's quite a sort of standard question, but it'd be interesting for me to know, how you see the future of art.
All right, from my viewpoint, sitting where in the sort of time slot where I was born and trained, in a way I sort of straddle the past to some extent. I mean, I've literally was trained in classical painting, oil painting on canvases, which is almost 800-900 years old, and the painting processes, of course, go many thousand years back beyond that. And suddenly there's been this birth of the digital age, and of course, in the same way as in the 19th century that photography challenged painting per se or image making per se, at first artists were obviously very threatened, and then of course people being people, they simply adapted and adopted those new technologies. So photography was adopted by people like Degas extensively into their own art making processes, and in fact assisted in helping develop modernism, modernist approaches to picture making. So in the same way that we now have the digital age where the moving image challenges the traditions of painting, it makes us completely anachronistic. I mean, what is it that is going to make somebody stop in front of a still image and actually look at it long enough to try and comprehend what the artist or originator, his intentions were? It's very, very difficult. And this is something that I obviously have to propound quite clearly to any students I have, that what they're up against is that moving image. Whether it be on television or whatever in a digital way, there still is a place for painting. There still is a place for good old-fashioned artwork, because even in this almost 25 years since the advent of a digital age in art, certainly, that people are still painting, people are still doing it. So the strangest thing is, I'm sure we could somehow cohabit next to each other. You know, we could find a comfortable way of actually cohabiting together.
Well, painting is more tactile, isn't it? I mean, that's the whole thing. There's a feeling there between you and the subject that is not just in your mind. It's also a sensory thing.
You're quite correct there. There's no question of it that, in a sense, the tactility and the actual presence of the real work is very, very important. What comes to mind is the still very, very salient essay written by Walter Benjamin in the 1920s about art in the age of mechanical reproduction, where he fundamentally states, and this is in simplified form, that the original artwork, the actual original, when you confront it, has an aura which a reproducible work does not have. What the reproducible work does have in its own right is it has an authority, an authorial sensibility about it. So they're two very, very different things, and they themselves, in a way, one can view originality as being something that is certainly in a tactile sense, is worth experiencing. But of course we live very, very vicariously in contemporary media, where everything is deferred, because when you look at a television screen, for instance, you're seemingly looking at reality, but what sort of reality are you looking at in a television screen? You're looking at pixelated dots.